coming to a chapter dealing with the virtue of autonomy in a book on intellectual virtue will seem a high point to many in our age. Well, it would be if many in our age not only read books, but also read books on intellectual virtues. Maybe I should start over. This chapter deals with the virtue of autonomy, thinking for ourselves. We live in an individualistic age, so thinking for ourselves strikes us as perhaps the paramount virtue. As committed individualists, we know that conformity, thinking like others, is the great vice. We need to free ourselves from the shackles that have been imposed on us by our parents, our peers, and the institutions of society. Thinking freely on our own is the goal. As we'll see in this chapter, King clearly identifies autonomy, thinking for ourselves, as a virtue. It is a good thing. We'll also see that thinking for ourselves might not be as easy as we assume. We might assume that because our way of thinking pits us against a loud and powerful segment of the populace, that must be a clear sign that we are indeed thinking for ourselves. In fact, it could be that we have fallen under the sway of a competing segment of the populace, and our assumption that we are thinking for ourselves is just an illusion. Because we value thinking for ourselves and want to be known to ourselves and others as people who think for ourselves, there can be an incentive to deceive ourselves into thinking we are thinking for ourselves. Taking up the virtue we covered in the previous chapter, we need to be careful in our analysis of where we stand if we are to uncover the truth. King starts the chapter with two illustrations of social movements that cut against the grain of powerful ways of thinking. Those who fought for women's rights had to contend with long dominant cultural forces and institutions built on the assumption that women were inferior and incapable of thinking for themselves. They needed men to guide them, to do their thinking for them. Women were seen as fickle, ruled by emotion. They were incapable of thinking for themselves. Men were assumed to be rational, insightful, and able to stand against forces of deception. Men were doing women a favor by doing their thinking for them. It doesn't take a deep knowledge of history to see that that model of male superiority and female inferiority has more holes in it than the piece of Swiss cheese on my sandwich yesterday. A way of seeing the world was matched with social power to keep the framework in place for ages. In at least some areas, it's still in place today. The second illustration comes from the world of science and focuses on the transition from geocentrism to heliocentrism. I know the history from having read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Copernican Revolution. You probably know Kuhn best from the book he wrote in the early 1960s, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. The latter book built on his work on the transitions associated with Copernicus and Galileo to argue against a simple straight line model of how science changes and progresses. Instead of the straight line, Kuhn wrote about paradigm shifts. If you use the Google Ngram tool, you can see Kuhn's phrase start to rise in use in the mid-1960s, and then exploding in popularity through the early 1990s. It remains popular through 2019, the most recent year available in the Ngram tool, though my perception is that I don't hear the term as often as I used to. The popular account of what we call the Copernican Revolution is that the scientists associated with this revolution had to learn to think for themselves rather than with the crowd. By thinking against the powerful people in their world, not just political and religious leaders, but also other scientists, they managed to bring about a victory for truth against the power of repression. Read Kuhn, and you'll see that there was much more involved than their thinking for themselves. To push the idea that the earth went around the sun rather than the other way around, they not only had to argue against people, they also had to argue against science and the evidence it had put forth. They even had to reason against the clear deliverances of their own perceptual apparatus. Just think of it. You've seen it, haven't you? With your own eyes, you've seen the sun rise in the east, traverse the sky during the day, and then set in the west. It's plain as can be that it's the sun doing the moving, not the earth. This last bit throws light on Galileo's short objection to those who challenged him, and yet it moves. You may have heard that pronouns are a big deal in our culture. People are taken to have their own pronouns, and justice requires that we honor their chosen pronouns. That's not something we're dealing with here. We're dealing in the next section of this chapter with another part of speech, prepositions. King begins with a reflection on the stories he's just told. He writes, as narratives of intellectual autonomy, the stories as told above are woefully incomplete. They paint their protagonists as solitary rebels and omit the ways in which these thinkers relied on others' intellectual capital. King then sums up his point this way. Autonomy requires thinking for ourselves, but not by ourselves. Those prepositions, for and by, they matter. Through the course, we've seen some features of our age. We've observed our strong tendency toward individualism. We've seen how in the area of ethics, this background assumption makes subjectivism seem an unavoidable truth. There's another feature of our age that also flows out of our individualism. I don't think we've mentioned it explicitly, but perhaps you've seen it in the world. We value being countercultural. The version of postmodernism described by French philosopher Francois Lyotard sees its primary ethos as skepticism, credulity about meta-narratives, the big stories that seek to explain the way the world is. Those big stories have survived our skepticism and continue to push us to conform. Okay, it might not be the same big stories, the same all-encompassing explanatory frameworks identified by Lyotard, but the phenomenon remains. This urge to be against the mainstream, sometimes it's spoken of as a generalized speaking truth to power, shapes all of our pursuit of truth and understanding. If the majority is for it, we're against it. If the majority is against it, we're for it. We're committed contrarians in the name of anti-authoritarianism. This value tears us apart if we stick to it too closely. Consider again King's examples. Since we value nonconformity and being contrarians for their own sake, should we look for scientists who will push back against heliocentrism? After all, heliocentrism is now the accepted orthodoxy. It's taught in our schools at all levels. Must we think for ourselves against the mainstream and turn back to geocentrism? Now, it might be that new evidence has come to light, or that we've discovered new ways of interpreting the evidence we have, and decide that we must return to geocentrism. Notice, however, that if this is the case, our move is not driven by going against authority or contrariness, but by what we take to be the evidence. Or consider the example of the move for women's rights. Now that the official position is that women are as able to think and to think well for themselves, that's our cultural orthodoxy, a belief not just taught in our schools, but a commitment enforced in many of our institutions. Should we then reject these rights simply because they have become mainstream? It might be my weak imagination that I can't imagine new evidence being brought and found that would take us back to a period of rationally approved male dominance. King's emphasis in this section is on how the virtue of autonomy exercised in the movement for women's rights in the Copernican Revolution was not an instance of people thinking by themselves. In each case, they relied on others thinking with them. In both cases, and we can find other examples, thinking autonomously required teamwork. Sometimes it's the teamwork and support that comes from working together that brings success. Some other times, it's that each person has a different piece of the puzzle, and only with all the people and their complementary pieces can the whole picture be assembled. Galileo's work in justifying Copernicus's heliocentrism not only relied on Copernicus's earlier work, but on the work of those who invented and produced telescopes. Without the telescope someone else had made, Galileo's discoveries in this area likely wouldn't have happened. King explains that the virtue of autonomy in thinking is found between the deficiency of servility and the excess of isolation. The thinkers who are servile just go with the flow, accepting whatever they're told. They don't need to think for themselves, since a reliable authority has already told them what to believe and how to think. King says that such a person takes no responsibility for the contents of her own mind. The vice of isolation keeps us from learning from others. We overestimate our own knowledge and reasoning powers. We think others will impinge on our right to think for ourselves. They want to oppress us and keep us down. Living at the point of virtue in this area requires us to reject both servility and isolation. When we are rightly autonomous, we will hold ourselves responsible for our beliefs and reasonings, even while we remain open to learning from others. We will not think ourselves too superior to receive correction or information from others. In the next section, King turns again to the same target metaphor he's been using in recent chapters. When we exercise the virtue of autonomy, we want to do it in terms of the right object, on the right occasion, for the right reason, and with the correct methods. On page 100, he imagines a spectrum of possible knowledge from novice to expert. He writes, as we progress along the spectrum, we're increasingly equipped to use the means experts use in thinking about the subject. In general, as we progress, it becomes more and more for us to exercise independent thinking. Now, whether we consider ourselves or others, there are areas in which we know little and areas in which we know more. If we are growing in knowledge, our growth will normally be uneven. As finite beings, we have limited time and resources. We cannot learn everything about every subject. As we become more knowledgeable in one area, perhaps even approaching expertise, we will necessarily have less time and resources to advance in other areas. Even those who are polymaths, experts in multiple areas, have subjects about which they know little or nothing. King's claim is that virtuous use of autonomy is directly proportional to where we are on the expertise spectrum. If we know quite a bit, we are more responsible for thinking for ourselves. If we know very little, responsible thinking and knowledge acquisition will require relying more on others. What are some ways you've experienced the virtue of thinking for yourself? Can you think of sometimes you did it well and appropriately? Can you think of sometimes you exercised autonomy in your thinking and things didn't turn out so well due to your blind spots or weak reasoning? How could your appreciation for this virtue be sharpened and improved?